Picture this. You're standing in the echoing stone halls of the Kremlin fortress, sometime in the winter of 1581. The snow outside swirls in icy spirals, but the cold inside is something far deeper. Not the chill of weather, but of fear. You hear the groan of rusted hinges, and through the gloom you glimpse it, an iron cage, suspended inches above the ground, dimly lit by torchlight. Inside, a young woman, entirely naked, her swollen belly a grotesque contrast to the steel that surrounds her. This woman is not a criminal. She's not a prisoner of war. She is the daughter-in-law of the most powerful man in Russia, and the wife of the man Ivan the Terrible has just murdered. Her name is Maria Nagaya, and what Ivan did to her may be one of the most depraved acts of cruelty ever perpetrated in the name of dynasty. Before we plunge into the horror of this forgotten chapter in Russia's imperial history, if you effin' meaning in peeling back the polished surface of historical myth, uncovering the raw and brutal truths beneath, consider supporting this kind of deep storytelling. It helps us keep history human, even when it's horrifying. This isn't just a tale about a brutal czar. It's a story about how absolute power becomes a sickness, turning fathers into murderers, women into vessels, and birth into punishment. The events you're about to hear are not legend, but a chilling echo of a court so steeped in paranoia and blood that even new life had to scream its way through iron. Let's begin with the man who built this nightmare. Ivan Fyodor Vasilyevich, or as history remembers him, Ivan the Terrible, did not begin his reign in madness. In his youth, he was eloquent, learned, and deeply religious. When he was crowned as the first official Tsar of all Russia in 1547, he promised renewal, a new era of orthodox glory, justice, and strength. For a while, he delivered. He reformed law codes, expanded the printing press, and opened new avenues for commoners to rise through merit. But beneath the reforms, the shadows had already begun to form. He had grown up in terror. Orphaned of parents, manipulated by boyars, and raised in a palace where trust was weakness, Ivan learned early that cruelty was a currency, and by the 1570s that currency had inflated into a frenzy. His private police force, the oprichniki, were torturing, executing, and burning whole cities to ash. Ivan himself watched the punishments with cold fascination, sometimes even participating. But the horror didn't stop there. As his paranoia grew, he began turning inward, not just on his people, but on his own family. And that's where Maria's story begins. She was young, perhaps no older than 17, when she was chosen to marry Ivan Ivanovich, the Tsar's beloved son and heir. The younger Ivan had a sense of dignity and rationality his father lacked. He spoke multiple languages, argued passionately for diplomacy over conquest, and defended his wife when rumors, often planted by the Tsar himself, began to swirl. He was protective of Maria, who by all accounts was kind, gentle, and already expecting their first child. But Ivan the Terrible didn't see a young couple starting a family. He saw betrayal. The details of what happened next come to us in whispers, preserved in the margins of chronicles, softened by distance, but never fully erased. It began with an argument. Some say it started with clothing. That Ivan the Terrible walked in on Maria while she was resting, heavily pregnant, her sleeves rolled above the elbows, a breach in his eyes of the strict modesty expected of Tsarist women. Others say the Tsar had grown convinced that Maria, like so many others before her, was part of a plot, a conspiracy to shame the royal bloodline by seducing his son, stealing power through pregnancy. But what they all agree on is this: Ivan struck. He turned not on Maria, not yet, but on his own son. The Tsar and Tsarevich fought viciously, their shouting echoing through the palace. Ivan Ivanovich defended his wife, called out his father's cruelty, his obsessions, his growing madness. That alone was a death sentence. In a moment of blind rage, the elder Ivan grabbed his scepter, a heavy gold-tipped staff, and drove it into his son's head. The younger Ivan fell, blood pooling beneath his body. He would linger in agony for hours, but the wound was mortal. Ivan the Terrible, it is said, collapsed beside his dying son, weeping, wailing, tearing his beard, crying out to God. But none of it changed what he had done, and then he turned to Maria. What does a tyrant do when guilt becomes unbearable? But admitting fault would shatter the illusion of divine authority? He creates a ritual, a punishment, a fiction in which he remains righteous, and everyone else must bleed to preserve the illusion. For Ivan, Maria became that fiction. Within hours of his son's death, the Tsar issued a command: strip her, confine her. Let her deliver this child not as a Tsarevna, but as a beast in a cage. A forged doctrine soon followed, declaring that Maria had provoked the Tsarevich's rebellion and needed to atone for the loss of royal blood. In a cold stone chamber beneath the Kremlin, an iron cage was suspended, barely large enough for a woman to stand. No bedding, no privacy, no light except the flicker of torches when guards came to stare. She was stripped of everything: her name, her dignity, her clothing, and placed inside, heavily pregnant, her body already in pain from grief, exhaustion, and the weight of unborn life. Witnesses later claimed that food was passed through the bars like to an animal, that Maria tried at first to cover herself with her long hair, that she wept silently or not at all. But the Tsar declared she was being purified, that the child would be born free of treason because its mother had been cleansed in iron. And so day after day, Maria waited, naked, freezing, alone. She was no longer in the cage, but the cage had entered her. After the birth, Maria was moved in silence. No public declaration marked her release. No procession, no relief, no priestly absolution. She was simply led barefoot down a narrow corridor, wrapped in coarse linen, her child taken from her arms without explanation. The guards avoided her eye. One of them made the sign of the cross, but quickly, as if fearing the gesture itself might burn, they placed her in a room near the convent walls, not within the convent proper, for she was not a nun and never would be. Her chamber had stone walls, a wooden cot, and nothing else. A small window let in gray light that changed with the seasons, but never offered warmth. The door was kept unlocked, but it didn't matter. There was nowhere to go. No one spoke to her about the child. No one said whether he lived or died. There were no cries in the night, no footsteps of a nursemaid nearby, no lullabies echoing through the corridor. It was as if the boy had vanished into the same shadow that swallowed her name. Maria had once been Tsarevna, a daughter-in-law to the ruler of all Rus. Now she was neither royal nor widow nor mother. She had no title, no duties, no language in which to scream. The days passed in ritual emptiness. She walked the perimeter of the room slowly, pressing her hand to the wall with each turn. Sometimes she stood at the slit of a window for hours, watching nothing. Sometimes she knelt without praying. Her silence was complete, but it was not passive. It had weight. It had purpose. She was not broken. She had been hollowed out, deliberately, piece by piece, and now she waited to see what remained. Outside, the court shifted. Ivan's violence became more erratic. He wept in public, then ordered executions in private. He wandered the palace in old robes, claimed visions of saints and demons, issued decrees that contradicted each other within hours. His enemies were everywhere. His bloodline was broken. His mind, once sharp and terrifying, had become a cracked mirror, reflecting only fragments of the world he thought he ruled. And yet no one stopped him. Not the church, not the boyars, not even those who feared for their lives. Power in Muscovy was too central, too total, too soaked in fear to resist. So they watched as he unraveled, and they kept their heads low. Somewhere deep inside the fortress, Maria Nagaya continued to live. Her name was no longer spoken. But her existence was a scar on the dynasty, on the court, on the man who believed her suffering had been righteous. She was not dead. And that perhaps was the most dangerous thing of all. The child lived, not in the palace, not in his mother's arms, but far from both, in a quiet estate under watchful eyes, raised not as a son, but as a symbol. His caretakers were loyal to the crown, which meant loyal to Ivan's fear, to his myths, to the idea that this infant, born in iron and silence, could be a vessel for redemption or ruin. No one dared call him by his father's name. That name had been erased, carved out of the court's memory like a heresy. The boy was referred to only in whispers as the Tsar's shadow or the child of punishment. Even among servants, the air thickened when his lineage was mentioned. He was living proof of something no one wished to remember. Ivan himself did not see the boy again for many months. When he did, it was not as a grandfather, but as a judge. He inspected the infant the way a man might examine a relic, curiously, reverently, and with a hidden fear that it might turn to ash in his hands. Maria was not told. She sat, still and waiting, through another winter. Her hair grew long and unkempt. Her body, no longer young, bore signs of the ordeal. Not just the weight loss or the stiffness in her joints, but something deeper, a kind of stillness that is earned only through the most complete helplessness. She no longer expected food at regular hours, no longer reacted to footsteps outside her door. She had become what the Tsar feared most, a witness who could not be silenced because she no longer cared whether anyone heard her. Once a priest came to her cell. He said nothing, merely watched her for a wakayong while then left a candle at her feet. She did not touch it. There were rumors that Maria had begun to see visions, that she spoke to the walls or to the spirit of her dead husband or to the child she had not held since the birth. But these were not the ravings of madness. They were whispers imposed on her by a court that needed her to be mad. It was easier to believe she had lost her mind than to accept that she remembered everything and chose silence anyway. Outside, Ivan was dying, not all at once, not dramatically. His body failed him in fragments, gout, trembling, sudden blackouts, fits of rage followed by collapse. He grew suspicious of the floor beneath his feet, believed poisons were hidden in the timber. He struck priests. He accused his own doctors of betrayal. He stopped sleeping. Then abruptly, he slept for days. The court held its breath. For nearly 4 decades, Ivan IV had been the will of God incarnate, the Tsar by fire and blood. But now the fire was flickering, and the blood, his own, was thin. It was during one of these fugue states that he asked to see her again. Not the child, Maria, but when the guards came to summon her, she refused to rise. She did not speak. She did not nod. She simply stared at the torchlight behind them, her hands folded over the place where her child had once rested. Eventually, the guards left. The Tsar forgot the request. And that was the last time her name was spoken in his presence. Days turned into months, and months threatened to become years. Maria remained in her stone chamber, a ghost within living flesh. The women of the court who once envied her beauty now dared not utter her name. It carried a curse. New intrigues rose and fell in the Kremlin's halls, but Maria's silent presence hovered like a storm cloud that never burst. In rare moments, footsteps approached her door, the scuff of boots on cold flagstones, the muted jangle of keys, and Maria would feel the old terror clutch at her chest. But no one ever entered with news. No one spoke her child's name. The guards delivered meals as if to a dangerous animal, sliding wooden bowls into the room without meeting her eyes. The silence grew thick, and Maria wore it like a shroud. Beyond her cell, Russia convulsed. Campaigns in Livonia bled the treasury dry. Famine stalked the countryside, plague whispered death through villages. In Moscow, merchants murmured of omens, a comet in the sky, a wolf prowling the city gates, a monk's prophecy of the Tsar's end. But Ivan lived on, his rage both shield and poison. Some nights, Maria heard bells tolling in the Kremlin towers, not for prayers, but executions. The bell's voice carried across frozen courtyards, into her narrow window slit, each peal a reminder of how many others had fallen to the same man who kept her trapped. She counted the bells when she could not sleep, each toll marking another life extinguished. Yet within her, something stirred, a stubborn ember of purpose. She began speaking aloud to the stone walls, not in madness, but in defiance. Whispered prayers, then memories. The warmth of her husband's hand, the lull of summer evenings before terror came. She spoke of her son, telling the empty air what she would have told him as a boy, that he was not born from shame, that his mother had loved him even when the world tried to erase them both. When the guards heard her voice, they crossed themselves. Rumors spread that the Tsarevna was communing with spirits, that she was cursed, that she saw visions of the Tsar burning in hellfire. The rumors reached Ivan, and though his mind twisted the tale, it planted a seed of dread. He began to dream of Maria, pale, hair tangled, eyes dark as river ice. In these dreams, she did not scream or plead. She only watched him, silent and unblinking, and Ivan awoke gasping for breath, convinced she carried the judgment of God. His advisors noticed his fraying composure. They begged him to release her, to end the scandal that clung to the court like a disease. But Ivan refused. He could not release her, because to do so would be to confess his crime. And so Maria's captivity continued, suspended by a man's terror of his own guilt. The winter of 1583 descended hard. Snow weighed rooftops until they creaked. Wolves came closer to the city walls. In the Kremlin, fires burned day and night, but warmth eluded the heart of its ruler. Ivan shuffled through dark halls, muttering to himself, clutching his scepter as if it were the only thing holding him to the earth. He demanded constant reports on his grandson, Maria's child, insisting on proof of his health, his obedience. He sent gifts, carved wooden toys, fur-lined garments, though he never saw the boy himself. The gifts were delivered by pale servants who hurried back with assurances the child thrived. For Maria, the only sign of her son's life came from these rumors that drifted to her chamber like smoke under a door. A careless word from a guard, a whispered name half heard before silence snapped back in place. She pieced together a mosaic of half-truths. He was alive, he grew strong, his hair was dark like his father's. These scraps became her heartbeat. Each night she lay awake, eyes fixed on the small square of night sky beyond her window, willing the stars to carry her love to a boy she could not hold. In early spring, the air began to thaw. Snow melted into rivulets along the Kremlin's walls, dripping in cold music. Maria stood at her window, feeling the first breath of warmth in years, and in that fragile sunlight, she remembered who she was. Not a ghost, not a curse. A mother still alive, still bound to a child who might yet remember her name. She began to plan, not escape. She had nowhere to run, but survival with purpose. She forced herself to eat what little food came. She sang to herself in hushed tones, lullabies from childhood, the melodies she once dreamed of sharing with her son. She traced letters on the stone with her fingertip over and over, his name, her name, prayers for mercy. And though the world beyond her cell remained indifferent, Maria Nagayai, the Tsarevna who had been caged and forgotten, began to reclaim something the Tsar could never steal, the Effiers, quiet power of hope. But as spring edged into summer, Ivan's health deteriorated more quickly. He staggered through audiences, forgetting names, issuing commands. He retracted minutes later. Some nights he would shout Maria's name in his sleep. Other nights, he called out for his dead son, sobbing like a child. Courtiers watched in terrified silence, for the Tsar's madness was now a roaring flame consuming the last of his reason. Maria's chamber door began opening more often. Messengers appeared with cryptic questions. Did she remember conversations with the Tsar? Could she swear loyalty to the next ruler? Each visit brought whispers of Ivan's decline, and with them, a dangerous possibility that the Tsar might die and Maria's fate could change with the wind. She answered carefully, always aware that a single word might seal her doom. One dusk, as thunder rolled across a bruised sky, a boy was led into her chamber. He was small, dark-haired, eyes wide with terror. For a moment, Maria thought she had conjured him from her dreams. Then he spoke her name, voice quavering but real. She fell to her knees, arms outstretched, and the world tilted back into color. The child she bore in iron was here, alive, trembling in the same air she breathed. Their embrace was brief. The guards wrenched him away, but not before Maria pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering words only he could hear, that he was loved, that he came from courage, that he must remember who he was. The boy's eyes held hers as he was pulled from the room, the echo of her voice his only shield against the darkness beyond. Days later, word spread like wildfire. Ivan the Terrible was dead. The Kremlin walls echoed with hurried steps, hushed arguments, the shifting of power from trembling hands. Boyars emerged from shadow, claiming alliances, swearing oaths to the new heir. Bells rang, but with a tone that carried relief rather than grief. Maria was taken from her chamber at dawn. For the first time in years, sunlight touched her face as she crossed the courtyard, eyes squinting at the sky's vast blue. She walked past soldiers who averted their gazes, past maids who crossed themselves. Each step was a victory, a reclamation of the life stolen from her. She was brought before the new rulers, men who spoke gently but whose eyes measured her value like merchants appraising rare goods. They offered soft words of forgiveness, cloaked in conditions. They spoke of her son as a symbol, a possible claimant, a pawn to strengthen fragile legitimacy. Maria listened, but in her heart, she vowed that if power demanded her boy's life, she would fight until her last breath. As spring flowers bloomed over the Tsar's fresh grave, Maria Nagaya stood unbroken. Once a caged girl, then a silent ghost, now a mother reborn in a land desperate for hope. She would not let her son be a shadow. She would teach him to remember and to endure. But the Kremlin was never a place of simple triumphs. Within weeks, whispers of new plots tangled through its corridors. Powerful families saw opportunity in the Tsar's death, each seeking to place their own heir or puppet upon the throne. Maria's son, born of Ivan's blood but touched by scandal, became both a prize and a threat. Offers came cloaked as kindness, marriages arranged before he could walk, alliances sealed with promises of safety. Maria recognized these bargains for what they were: attempts to bind her son to masters who cared nothing for his life or legacy. She refused them all, retreating to a small estate granted in cautious generosity by the new court. There, at the edge of dense birch forest, Maria began to raise her child in earnest. She taught him not the language of courtly deceit, but of survival, how to read the stars, how to find calm in silence, how to see danger in the shifting eyes of powerful men. At night, she told him stories of his father, not of his violent end, but of his dreams for a Russia that might one day know peace. And though soldiers still came to watch them from afar, and rumors still crawled like vipers through the capital, Maria and her son endured. For the first time in years, mother and child shared dawns and dusks free of iron and stone. And in that fragile peace, they began to stitch together the fragments of a life stolen, determined that their story would not end in silence. Years later, historians would look back on Maria Nagaya's life and see only footnotes: a tragic widow, a forgotten consort, a pawn of dynastic struggle. But those who stood close enough to hear her voice knew a different truth. She had survived the unthinkable, preserved the life of a child destined to be hunted, and reclaimed her own identity from the ashes of Ivan's madness. Her story reminds us that history's grand narratives, the rise and fall of czars, the clash of armies, are built on the quiet, stubborn endurance of individuals. Maria's cage was meant to break her, yet it became proof of her unyielding will. Her silence was not surrender, but strategy. And her love for her son, fierce and unwavering, outlasted the empire that sought to erase them both. In the end, Maria Nagaya stands as a testament that even in a world ruled by terror, the human spirit can endure, defy, and remember. And that sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply to survive and to teach your child how to do the same.